Hi, I'm Gregory Talkborn with GNT Learning. In today's episode, I'm going to help you extend the results of K-means clustering into making predictions on labeled data. Now, K-means clustering is an unsupervised model, but if we happen to have labels or other interesting information about the clusters, we can turn that information into nice predictions. I'm assuming today you have a basic understanding of what K-means clustering is, and you just need a little help building on that knowledge to actually make those predictions. We start today with an empty notebook aside from a few imports. We're going to be using Numpy to do some of the heavy math lifting for us. We're going to use matplotlib.pyplot in order to make some figures so we can kind of see what's going on along the way. Strictly speaking, this isn't necessary for anything we do today, but it makes it a lot more visually appealing and easy to understand. And then we're going to also import from sklearn.datasets this Kmeans function. Kmeans function is going to generate a data for us. So let's go ahead and start with generating that data we're going to work with today. Now, the Kmeans function returns two things: a set of data, which we're going to call x, in this case xtrain, and a set of labels, which I'm going to call ytrain. Now, this Kmeans function is really ideal for building a test set that you can do these sort of basic clustering exercises on. By default, it's going to give us a set of 100 values in a two-dimensional space. To kind of show that off here, I'm going to look at the xtrain. And again, we see 100 data points in a 2D space. Now, it's going to be kind of hard to describe what this Kmeans function looks like exactly. So rather than use words, let's go ahead and make a plot so we can just see what's going on. To do that, we're going to go ahead and use plot.scatter, and we're going to plot the two different dimensions of our training data against each other. Right. So the notation here, for those not super familiar with Numpy, is that we are using a colon here to take all the rows and the 0th column of the data, and we're going to plot it against all of the rows and the first column of the data. So this gives us our 2D sort of plot. Now, we want to go ahead and color these points based on the label they have. So set C equals ytrain. And lastly, for convenience here, I'm going to go ahead and set a different coloring scheme than default, so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So go ahead and run this. We see that the Kmeans function gave us this interesting set of data, colored here in red and blue, and it can't be trivially separated by a simple dividing line. Instead, the data is a little bit intermixed. And this noise parameter we used up here actually controls how distinct the red and blue regions are versus how much they overlap. So this gives us an interesting problem to try to separate and do classification on. Now, besides this training data, we're also going to need a second set of data for validation. As part of this process, we're going to have to change how many clusters we divide this into, and as such, that gives us another parameter to evaluate. So we really need to be able to see how that parameter changes the results. So we go ahead and make a validation set using the exact same function, and this will give us an independently generated set of points following the same rules. And we'll go ahead and rerun this. We'll see we now have a slightly different training set, and the validation set has also been created for us. Great. We have data, so let's cluster it. K-means is simple enough that you could build your own clustering routine from scratch without any real undue difficulty. And if you want to do that, please check out a link in the description to see where we've done that previously. Otherwise, for today, I'm going to proceed by using the built-in Kmeans clustering algorithm available from sklearn inside of cluster. Now, this is solely a choice based on convenience, because once you know how the algorithm works, there's really no reason not to just use the convenient tool that's available. Now we've written our import. Of course, make sure to rerun your cell so that it's actually imported. Then we're going to come down here and set up our clustering. To do the clustering, we need to pick a number of clusters to use. We're going to go ahead and start with 5 today. We then need to instantiate a Kmeans object. And as part of that, we need to tell it how many clusters it's going to use. We then go ahead and fit our training data. And that's really all it takes to do the clustering. But again, we're trying to understand what we're doing today. So let's print out a few things so we can see what's going on under the hood. First, we're going to print out the cluster centers, which will show us where the clusters are being created at. And we're also going to go ahead and look at the predicted values of the clustering for the training data. Provided we don't have any typos, this will give us a nice result. So we can see here that there's some set of coordinates being generated. This corresponds to where the different centers of the clusters are. Not particularly human readable, this format. And we also predict what the cluster is for each of the points. This is the point where a lot of students get confused. We only have 2 labels for our data, so why are there 5 different values being predicted? Well, the reason for this is that we are predicting the clusters, not the labels at this point. So far there's no connection back to what the actual labels of the data are. And if we look at the code itself, we see we use xtrain, but we've not used the ytrain anywhere. And this is because Kmeans is an unsupervised learning method, so it's completely blind to labels by itself. To make this into a supervised prediction, we need to somehow connect these clusters back to the identities of the labels. Again, it's going to be useful here to do a little bit of visualization. So let's go ahead and make another plot overlaying where these cluster centers are so we can see what's going on a little more clearly. Right, do that, come here, paste this, and we're going to do two versions of the plot. The first version is just going to be the raw points as above, and the second version we're going to plot where the centers are that we have predicted. Cluster centers. And we're going to go, and again, the cluster centers, just like the original data, have two columns, so we can plot them the same way. This time, we don't really have an idea of what label they belong to, so I'm just going to color all of them green. I'm also going to make a more distinctive marker for them. Marker equals X, and instead of using our default map there, the only other thing I want to do is change to make the X's relatively large. Let's go ahead and look what that produces. Oh, and we have a little typo there. Gotta actually do that. All right, and so now we have our same original data with an X placed wherever the centers of the different clusters are. So this is what the K-means algorithm actually did for us so far. It just defined the middle of clusters. In some sense, you can think of this as just segmenting this continuous 2D space into a sample collection of locations represented by where data exists. For example, we see there's blue data here, there's red data here. So in general, there's some points up here, some points down here, but there's no cluster over here because there's no points over here. Now, to help us see how this 2D space is being divided up more fully, we're going to turn to a trick from our video on visualizing classification boundaries. Again, there's a link available in the description if you want the long version of that. What we're going to do here is we're going to generate a grid of possible points in the space and use the cluster predictions on each one. We can then do this over a range of values and figure out what everything looks like. We're going to go ahead and define this a little bit before we make our plots here. So we need to define a few variables. The first one is going to be this x0 values, which we're going to use np.linspace to define. So this is going to be the range of values in our plot on this first, or the x-axis of the plot itself. And we're going to say it goes from about negative 1.5 to a value of 2.5, and we need about 100 points to kind of fill in that space. We're going to do the same thing in the other dimension, which we'll call x1. And here the range of values is something like negative 1 to 1.5. With those values in hand, we're then going to turn to a little trick using np.meshgrid. Now this is a little bit long to explain, and I want to derail the focus of this video to get into all the details here. So again, look at the other video on visualizing classification boundaries if you want a detailed explanation of why this all works out here. But in essence, what we're doing is we're using the x0 and x1 values generated by these linspaces in order to create a list of all possible coordinates that are visible in the plot, and doing a little bit of reshaping magic to get that in the right format for us. And we go ahead and just look at chords directly. We can see that's indeed what we have. So we go from negative 1.5, negative 1, so down the bottom left corner over here. Then we slowly go through larger and larger values in this direction. And we just keep rastering across the entire image until we eventually get all the way to the top right of 2.5 and 1.5. Great. With this list of coordinates in hand, it's now easy enough to make a nice colored background that shows all of the different clusters. And again, we're going to use the same basic logic for plotting that we did above, where we get the two different columns of values for coordinates. And this time we color by the prediction of the clustering. And in this case, we're going to set the CMAP to a different CMAP so we get a different set of colors, which will be more self-explanatory in a moment. And we're also going to set this alpha value to 0.04, which will make this background semi-transparent so it doesn't just block out what's going on with the red and the blue points. Putting all this together and running this, we can now distinctly see that there are 5 really clearly defined regions that show where each cluster is. So in addition to having the center X that denotes and defines the cluster, we can see how space is being divided amongst these clusters. Now, to close the gap to predicting labels, we need each cluster to tell us which label it should be associated with. Visually for us, that's pretty clear. For example, this should probably be a blue cluster because all the points are in blue. This should be a red cluster. But this cluster, for example, and this one are a little bit more mixed. So there's some question about, is this really a blue cluster or a red cluster? And the simplest solution here is to say, well, look at how many points are in the cluster, do a majority vote. So there's more red points than blue points, so this should be our red cluster. And again, we have to do the counting in this one to see, but probably this is going to be a blue cluster. All right, so let's formalize that idea with a little bit of code. To do that, I'm going to make a dictionary that's going to allow us to map the values of cluster to what label we feel it should correspond to. I'm just going to call this cluster Y. We're going to build this by looping through all of the possible clusters that exist. We then want to grab the value that corresponds to that cluster, or rather the values that correspond to that cluster. So we can say, well, when our labels in our training set are the same as I, this will give us a Numpy object as a list of true and false values. And one of the beautiful things about Numpy here is that we can, because Y trains a Numpy array, use this syntax to simply grab all of the points from Y whose labels match this value. What that means is that for a particular cluster, I'm grabbing all of the labels from that cluster so I can see what they are. Now, we need to figure out what the majority is. So again, it can be obvious from the picture, it's going to be red or blue, but how do we do that in code is a little bit more annoying. Fortunately for us, there exists a built-in that's pretty handy here. And that built-in is called counter, and it's part of the default collection package. So this is just a package that is built into every Python environment collections, and we can pull counter from it. And what counter is going to do, come down here, is we can say counts equals the counter of this. And let's just go ahead and start with just looking at what this does to kind of get a basic idea. So in this case, what we see is that for the 0th cluster, the counter result was this. It said that the number 1, or the label 1, appeared 23 times. And that was it. The second cluster, the label 0, appeared 16 times. In this cluster, 0 appeared 15 times, 1 appeared 10 times, and so on and so forth. And so counter is just a really nice, convenient way to do some counting. Now, as you can see, this is kind of a little bit more complicated object and is giving us more information than we directly need. What we really want to know is just what's the most common one. And conveniently, counter actually has a built-in method that will just give us that result directly. So you say most common. Now, strictly speaking, the most common actually returns just an organized set of information that's complete. So really it's the same exact information but organized a little bit differently. Rather than go through a couple rounds of picking back and forth, I'll just simply note that if you 0, 0 afterwards, you'll get the value you want. Basically, most common gives you all the information. 0 will give you the tuple of the first or most common set of values, and then 0 is the actual label itself, whereas 1 here would be the count of that label. All right. So we're going to go ahead and call this label. And then we can go ahead and just say for our little dictionary here that the cluster I now corresponds to this label. And so if we just look at our final result for this, we can see that cluster 0 is going to get a label of 1, cluster 1 is a label of 0, and so on and so forth. Now, we could do a bunch of additional work here to verify this by hand, because, for example, we see 5 clusters up here. Which one is cluster 0? I'm not sure. And the labels 0 and 1, which one's red, which one's blue? Again, I'm not sure off the top of my head. We could spend a lot of time to visualize that, and it could be a useful exercise if you want to get into it. But the basic idea is that we now have a mapping between these cluster numbers and the label numbers. So the last step in making our predictions is applying this to the actual points. To do this, we're going to do a little list comprehension. For the benefit of those less familiar with list comprehensions, we're going to start out with a very verbose form of this, and then I'll go ahead and simplify it afterwards. So our predictions, we're going to start off an empty list for all our predictions, and we're going to loop through all of the predictions that are being made from the Kmeans itself. So these predictions here are really predictions of which cluster it belongs to. We can then use our mapping here to convert that cluster into a actual label, and that'll be the prediction we want to make. So predtrain.append that. Now this is a verbose little bit of code, so we can sort of just make this a little more compact and readable by converting it into a list comprehension. And that list comprehension is going to look like is simply putting the for loop inside of the object directly and taking the thing we want to append and putting it in front of the for. So these two pieces of code do the identical thing, but once you're a little more used to list comprehensions, it's a lot easier to read, okay, apply this transformation, I look it up in the dictionary, as you loop through the data produced by the prediction. So that'll be our training predictions. And once we have some training predictions, we want to know, well, how good are they? And to that end, we're going to calculate a accuracy score. So we're going to have to go back in a moment and actually import accuracy score if we wish to use it. But it takes simply two arguments, the correct answers and our predicted answers, and tells us how well we're doing. Accuracy score itself is one of the many metrics available from sklearn that are very conveniently provided for us. And in theory, you could always implement these things yourself. Run that, come down here, and we can go ahead and print our training accuracy. And we see that using 5 clusters, the model is able to correctly predict 85% of the answers. We want to see how this does, of course, on the validation set as well. We can do that with just a little bit of variable renaming. So validation there. Valid. And so then we can see that our training set we got 85% accuracy, and in our validation set we got 89% accuracy. So we got a little bit lucky there. The validation set must be a little bit more cleanly separated than the training set, just by random chance. So great, we built a model and we saw how it did with a set of 5 clusters. Now the next question is, what is the best number of clusters to use? So we need to kind of pull all this code together into one place and see if we can actually make a set of predictions and test out and optimize our values. For that, we want to try out k values in the range from, say, 2 to 20. All right. And we want to repeat this entire process. So we're just going to go back up here and for the moment just copy and paste some code together to make this happen. Now, for those that are more used to sort of proper code management and things, this gets to be kind of an alarm bell. It's like, I'm copying and pasting code. Isn't this a terrible idea? And the answer is only if you plan on keeping all of this. In practice, if you're trying to make a nice final project here, you'd want to actually replace the code above with this piece of code I'm writing right here. But for demonstration purposes and learning, it makes a lot of sense to kind of just keep all the little pieces around for the moment. All right. And lastly, we need to grab this bit of code here, put it here. All right, we don't need to actually see what the cluster Y is. And we need to print K. Now, just for readability, because that always is important, we're going to go ahead and make a few notes here. So we're going to do the clustering, map which label each cluster is, and evaluate results. Great. So if I don't have any typos, we can run everything here. And we get a pretty simplistic little report being generated. So we see different values of k, the training accuracies, and the validation accuracies. Now in this particular case, we found we actually have a couple different values of k that gave us the same optimal value for the validation accuracy. When in doubt, it's usually best to default to the simplest model. So we're going to go with 9 as being our best possible solution. All right, so the last thing you probably want to do here is visualize this final answer in a really clear way. So we're going to go ahead and repeat the clustering and the mapping of the clusters to labels one last time. Go ahead and do this. Move that over. And we're going to set a k of 9 because we know that's the optimal k. run that to do the actual fitting. And now we want to go ahead and reproduce our plots. We're going to need to grab a little bit of logic here. The range of the points in our plot didn't really change, so you don't have to rerun our little bit of code up here in terms of defining what coordinates exist. But we do need to use this bit of logic here in order to apply this mapping of labels to our points if we want to make a nice little colored version. So we can go ahead and put this here, and we're going to make a preds coords, where we predict not instead the x training values, the y training values, predict that's this set of arbitrary or systematic set of coordinates that we're using for plotting. Okay, we don't actually need this at the moment. And then we can reproduce the same sort of plotting we did above. Okay, go ahead and grab this. Bring this on down. We're going to go ahead and drop the x's themselves. Those are not as interesting. And we just want to see the background colors. But now, instead of coloring it based upon the cluster it belongs to, we're going to color it based on the label we have figured out for that cluster. We also want to make sure here we want to change the color map to be the same because we have the same variable we're using. And while we're here, let's go ahead and do this twice, once for the training data set and once for the validation data set, so we can see what's going on in both cases. Valid, valid, valid. And hopefully you don't have any typos here. And of course we inevitably do. So we're going to fix that up. Run that. And we now have two plots, top one for training, bottom one for validation, showing how our predictions based on clusters are performing in the two data sets. And we see we have a nice little blue region defined by the model and a nice little red region defined by the model. And in general, it's doing pretty well. Now the last thing we want to do here is to have a true final independent test. One problem with looking at these results on this validation data set is that we use the validations data set to figure out how many clusters to break it into, which means inevitably we chose the answer that might just be a little bit oddly lucky for this particular validation set. So we really need a third independent data set to use here. Conveniently, this makeMoons function just continuously generates new data from the same kind of distribution for us. So we can just grab it and make a third and final independent test set that we can use right here. So let's call this x test, y test. We can repeat our little calculation here. Let's go ahead and just grab it from up here for convenience. Just grab both these lines. All right, so we have preds on our final independent test set. Test set. Test. Test. Print our test accuracy, and finally reproduce this exact kind of plot with our labeled background. Notice here we don't have to recalculate what the coloring for the coordinates is because that was part of the model prediction. All we have to do is put a different set of points in front of it in order to see how well we're doing. Run that, and we see we get 95% accuracy, so almost the same. And we can see it still looks pretty good. It gets a little bit of problems here, a little bit of problems there, but in general is doing quite well. With that, we've demonstrated and tested how to use Kmeans clusters and unsupervised learning method to make predictions. We started with blind clustering of the data, then we applied our own rule for classification. Now, we do this by looking at the different points in each cluster and deciding what we think it should mean. Now, rather than do this in a completely manual way, we did a simple little rule of saying it's majority vote, made a little code to do this for us automatically, and then used this to map answers from the cluster prediction to this label prediction. And in the end, we see that we actually got a pretty sensible model that made reasonable predictions on our final test set. Now, important side note today is that the data set we used had 2 dimensions in it. And that was important for making nice little visualizations so we could see what it was doing. But actually the general methodology, aside from the plotting itself, does extend to a higher number of dimensions without any real problem. Now, K-means may not always be the best model form to use, especially in higher dimensions, but the basic method does work. So now you know everything you need in order to classify data using K-means clustering. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to those whose contributions help fund and sustain creating content like this. As always, the code produced today is available on GitHub through a link in the description. Remember to like, subscribe, push all the buttons, click all the things, and I'll see you next time.